The first battle was supposed to last 6 hours, and the Valkyrie commanders had calculated every variable with perfect precision. They had studied human tactics and analyzed human weapons and measured human courage against their own ancient experience. They had concluded that humanity would fall before the sun rose over Earth. They were wrong by 11 days. Admiral Corveth of the Dominion watched from his command ship as the human fleet tore through the Valkyrie formation like a blade through silk, and his eyes narrowed as he tried to understand what he was seeing. Humans should have been dead within the first hour, and their ships should have been scattered wreckage floating in the void, and their world should have been burning beneath orbital bombardment. Instead, the Valkyrie hive ships were dying by the dozens. Impossible. Admiral Vesik of the Korath hissed through the communication channel. These are primitives with primitive technology, and they should not be able to do this. Corveth said nothing as he watched another Valkyrie dreadnought dissolve into atoms under the beam of a human weapon. He had seen those weapons before. That was not quite right, and he had never personally seen them. But his genetic memory stretched back 40,000 years, and somewhere deep in that ancestral knowledge, he recognized the energy signatures now filling his sensors. Pull back the Valkyrie, he commanded, and have the Korath take the forward position. The Korath do not take orders from the Dominion. Vesik snapped. Then watch your crystal ships die the same way the hive ships are dying. Corveth replied calmly, or listen to me and survive long enough to understand what we are truly facing. The Korath admiral fell silent for a moment, and then his fleet began to move back from the front. Linus Corveth turned to his aide, a young officer named Veth who had served him for 2 centuries. Access the sealed archives. Corveth ordered, authorization code Omega-7 Prime, and search for any records matching the weapon's signatures. We are detecting. Veth's scales turned pale at the mention of the sealed archives, for those records had not been opened since before the conclave was formed, and they contained knowledge that was forbidden to all but the highest admiral's high admiral. Those archives require unanimous conclave approval to access. Veth said nervously, the conclave gave me command of this fleet, Corveth replied, and I will not lead 40,000 ships to their deaths because of bureaucratic protocols. He leaned closer to his aide and lowered his voice. There is something about these weapons that I almost remember, he said. Something from the oldest memories of my line. And if I am right about what that something is, then we are all in terrible danger. Veth nodded and began accessing the forbidden records out in the void. The battle continued to rage. Commander Vasquez stood at the center of the Defiance Bridge and coordinated the human defense with a focus that bordered on supernatural. And she directed her captains like chess pieces, always staying one move ahead of the Enemite precursor weapons. Were performing beyond anyone's expectations. Primary cannon had fired 17 times, and each shot had destroyed multiple enemy vessels, and the Conclave admirals had learned to fear its white beambit. The cannon was not their only weapon. Human soldiers on boarding craft carried rifles that fired projectiles through dimensional folds, and the bullets would enter a fold in front of the rifle and exit behind the target's armor, and no shield in the galaxy could stop an attack that simply bypassed it. Anti-human frigates generated defensive barriers that existed partially outside normal spacetime, and enemy weapons would pass through them and emerge somewhere else entirely, sometimes striking the very ships that had fired them. Human cruisers engaged engines that bent space around them, and they could outmaneuver dreadnoughts 10 times their size, and they could appear behind enemy formations and strike before anyone knew they were there. The Conclave had never faced technology like this, and they had believed themselves the masters of the galaxy, and they had assumed that their million-year head start would always keep them ahead. They had been wronged. In the bridge of his command ship, Corveth finally received the data from the sealed archives, and as he read the ancient records, his blood ran cold. This cannot be, he whispered. Weapon signatures matched. Every single one of them matched the records of weapons that had been used against the Dominion and the other Conclave races a million years ago, and those weapons had been wielded by beings who should no longer exist. High Admiral, Veth asked, seeing the change in his commander's expression, what do the records say? Corveth did not answer immediately, and instead he stared at the tactical display where human ships continued to tear apart the Conclave fleet. The precursors, he finally said. The weapons matched the precursors. Veth shook his head in confusion, but the precursors are extinct. He said, "We destroyed them in the First War, and there are monuments on 100 worlds celebrating their defeat. We believed we destroyed them." Corveth corrected, "We believed we won that war, and we believed they were gone forever, and we believed the threat was ended." He turned to face his aide with an expression of ancient dread. What if we were wrong about all of it? The battle raged for 11 days before Corveth finally called for a full retreat. To the Cooper Perimeterth Conclave had lost over 12,000 ships, and humanity had lost less than 200, and the mathematics of the war had changed completely as the enemy fleet fell back to regroup. Commander Vasquez allowed herself a moment of exhausted relief. They had survived the first assault, but she knew this was only the beginning. "Commander," Lieutenant Chen called from her station, "we are receiving a transmission from Mars, Priority Omega, and it is from Dr. Tanaka at the excavation site." Vasquez felt a chill run down her spine, because Priority Omega meant a discovery that could change everything. Put her through. Vasquez ordered. Yuki Tanaka's face appeared on the screen, and the scientist looked pale and shaken, but also filled with an excitement that bordered on madness. "Commander Vasquez," Tanaka said urgently, "we have found something beneath Site 7, and you need to see this immediately." "What have you found, Doctor?" Tanaka took a deep breath before answering. "We found the beings who built the weapons," she said. "And Commander, they are not dead." Vasquez gripped the railing as the implications hit her. "They are sleeping," Tanaka continued, "thousands of them in stasis pods, and they have been waiting for a very long time." She paused and looked directly into the camera. "And they are starting to wake up." The transmission came at midnight, and it carried the death sentence of an entire species. Commander Elena Vasquez stood on the bridge of the UES Defiance, humanity's greatest warship, and watched the message play across the main screen for the third time. Conclave of 12 had spoken, and their words were final. "The species known as humanity has been judged," the alien voice declared in cold, mechanical tones that the translation software struggled to process. "You have expanded beyond your permitted boundaries, and you have committed the unforgivable sin of touching precursor technology, and for these crimes, the Conclave has declared your extinction." Vasquez felt her hands grip the railing in front of her as the message ended, and around her, the bridge crew sat in stunned silence. Lieutenant Commander Park was the first to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. "They cannot be serious," he said. "We have done nothing wrong, and we have followed every protocol they gave us." But Vasquez knew better, and she had seen this coming for years. Humanity had grown too fast for the comfort of the ancient races, and they had spread across 100 worlds in just 3 centuries, and they had built fleets and armies and civilizations that rivaled species millions of years older. And then they had found the weapons. Vasquez remembered the day the excavation teams on Mars had uncovered the first vault, and she remembered the confusion and excitement as engineers pulled devices from the ancient chambers that made no sense. And she remembered the fear in the eyes of the Conclave ambassadors when they learned what humanity had discovered. The precursors had been gone for 1,000,000 years, vanished without explanation, and every species in the galaxy had learned to fear the technology they left behind. But humanity had not feared it, and instead they had studied it and learned from it and eventually figured out how to make it work. That had been humanity's true crime, and the Conclave could not allow a young species to possess the power of gods. "How long do we have?" Vasquez asked, turning to her tactical advice. Lieutenant Chen pulled up the sensor data, and her face went pale as the numbers appeared on her screen. "They are already here, Commander," she said. "The Conclave fleet jumped into our outer system 17 minutes ago, and they are approaching at maximum speed." Vasquez moved to the tactical display and felt her stomach drop as she saw the enemy formation. 40,000 ships filled the screen, and they came from 12 different civilizations, and each one represented millions of years of military evolution. The Velthri sent their massive hive ships, organic vessels that could spawn fighter swarms by the thousands, and the Koroth brought their crystal dreadnoughts that could shatter moons with a single blast, and the Dominion deployed their ancient war machines that had conquered galaxies before humans had learned to walk upright against this armada. Humanity had gathered everything they could. 800 ships waited in formation around Earth, and they were the pride of human engineering, but they looked like toys compared to the enemy fleet. "We cannot win this," Park said quietly. The mathematics are impossible, and we should negotiate, or surrender, or find some way to save as many people as we can." Vasquez shook her head slowly. "The Conclave does not want our surrender," she said. "They want our extinction, and there is no negotiation for that." She turned to face her crew, and she saw the fear in their eyes. But she also saw something else beneath the fear: defiance. Humanity had never been good at accepting the impossible, and they had never been willing to simply lie down. "And I send a message to Admiral Chen on the Resolute," Vasquez ordered. "Tell him to authorize the Lazarus Protocol." Park's eyes widened at her words. "Commander, the Lazarus weapons are untested," he said. "We do not fully understand how they work, and the scientists say they could be dangerous to our own ships." The scientists also said, "We had another 50 years before the Conclave would move against us," Vasquez replied. "They were wrong about that, and I am willing to bet they are wrong about the weapons too." She walked to the center of the bridge and activated the fleet-wide communication channel. "All ships, this is Commander Vasquez of the Defiance," she announced. "The Conclave has come to destroy us, and they believe we are helpless, and they believe we will die quietly, like good little primitives." She paused and let her words sink in. "Across the fleet, they are wrong. In the armories of every capital ship, you'll find weapons that no human engineer fully understands, and these weapons were found beneath the surface of Mars, and they were built by beings who existed long before the Conclave rose to power. We do not know who made them, and we do not know why they left them for us to find. But we know one thing for certain: these weapons work. Today we will show the Conclave that humanity does not die quietly, and today we will teach them that they should have left us alone." She closed the channel and turned back to her crew. "Lieutenant Chen, activate the primary weapon," she ordered, "and target the lead Valkyrie hive ship." Chen nodded and began entering commands. And deep within the Defiance, systems that had lain dormant for 200 years began to hum with power. The weapon had been the greatest discovery of the Mars excavation, and it was a massive cannon that ran through the center of the ship, and it drew power from a source that no human physicist could explain. When the engineers had first activated it in testing, the beam had punched through an asteroid the size of a small moon and kept going until it dissipated somewhere beyond the orbit of Jupiter. Nobody knew what it would do to a living ship. "Weapon charged and ready, Commander," Chen reported. "Target locked on the lead Valkyrie vessel." Vasquez looked at the tactical display one last time, and she saw the 40,000 enemy ships bearing down on her world, and she saw the 800 defenders standing in their path. Odds were impossible, and the mathematics said they would lose, and every logical calculation pointed to extinction. But humanity had never been good at listening to mathematics. "Fire," Vasquez commanded. The Defiance shuddered as the cannon released its fury, and a beam of pure white energy lanced across the void toward the Valkyrie hive ship. And when it struck, the universe held its breath. The hive ship did not explode, and it did not break apart, and it did not burn. It simply ceased to exist. The beam unraveled the massive vessel at the atomic level, and the destruction spread outward in a sphere of dissolution that consumed 9 other ships, before finally fading into nothing. For a long moment, silence filled the bridge. Then Chen spoke in a voice filled with wonder and terror. "Commander, the enemy fleet has stopped advancing," she said. "They are holding position." Vasquez allowed herself a small smilith. Conclave had expected primitives, and they had expected an easy slaughter, and they had expected humanity to die without a fight. They had no idea who had built these weapons, but they were about to learn. 3 kilometers beneath the Martian surface, Drive Yuki Tanaka stood before a sight that no human had ever imagined. The chamber stretched before her, like the inside of a cathedral, with walls that curved upward into shadows and a ceiling lost somewhere in the darkness above. And every surface glowed with a soft blue light that pulsed like a heartbeat. And along those walls, rising in rows that seemed to go on forever, were the pods, thousands of them, each one containing a figure frozen in perfect stillness. Tanaka approached the nearest pod and wiped the dust from its surface, and her breath caught in her throat as she saw the face within. The figure looked almost human. It was taller than any human, with sharper features and skin that had a faint silver sheen, but the basic shape was unmistakable, and the resemblance was too perfect to be coincidence. "Run a genetic scan," she ordered her assistant, a young man named Marcus, who looked as stunned as she felt. Marcus fumbled with his equipment. For a moment, Before pressing a scanner against the pod's surface, the results came back almost instantly, and Marcus stared at his screen with an expression of disbelief. "This cannot be right." He said, "What does it say?" Tanaka demanded. "The DNA match is 99.7%, Marcus replied. "Dr. Tanaka, these beings share almost all of their genetic code with humans." Tanaka felt the world shift beneath her feet as she understood what that meant. These were not aliens, and they were not strangers from distant stars, and they were not unknown beings who had simply chosen to hide their weapons on Mars. They were familiar. Ancient systems began to flicker around them as if responding to their presence, and holographic displays materialized in the air, showing images and symbols that made no sense of it. Tanaka's neural implant worked quickly, analyzing the language patterns and building a translation matrix from the context. "Welcome, children," a voice said from the display, and Tanaka spun around to see a holographic figure standing behind her. It was a recording of a woman who resembled the figures in the pods, tall and silver-skinned with eyes that held the weight of ages. "If you are hearing this message, then our plan has succeeded," the recording continued. "You have survived and grown and found the gifts we left for you. And now you face the enemy that drove us to sleep." The holographic image shifted to show a map of the galaxy as it had been a million years ago. Tanaka saw a vast civilization spanning thousands of star systems, and she saw the same silver-skinned beings building wonders that defied imagination. And she saw them living in peace for countless generations. Then she saw the war. "We called ourselves the architects," the recording explained. "And we built this galaxy into a garden of life and knowledge and beauty. And for a million years we guided the younger races toward enlightenment." The image showed the conclave species as they had been in ancient times, primitive and struggling and desperate to grow. "We helped them," the recording said. "We gave them technology and wisdom and the chance to become something greater. And in return they turned on us." Tanaka watched as the younger races banded together against their benefactors, and she saw massive fleets attacking architect worlds, and she saw cities burning and populations fleeing, and a civilization crumbling under the weight of betrayal. "They feared us," the voice continued. "They looked at what we had built, and they saw only a threat, and they decided that the only way to be safe was to destroy us completely." The hologram showed the architects retreating, losing world after world to the combined might of the races that would become the conclave. "We could have destroyed them," the recording said. "We had weapons that could have turned their homeworlds to ash and erased them from existence. But we chose not to use them." Tanaka leaned forward, desperate to understand why. She whispered. The recording seemed to hear her question. "Because we knew that one day they would try again," the voice explained. "We knew that they would find another young race to fear, another civilization to destroy, another species to condemn. And when that day came, we wanted our children to be ready." The hologram shifted to show Mars as it had been a million years ago, green and alive and covered in architect cities. "We seeded your world with our genetic legacy," the recording said. "We left our weapons where you would find them when you were ready. And then we came here to sleep and wait." The display showed the architects entering their pods one by one, thousands of them choosing hibernation over extinction. "We knew the conclave would declare war on you eventually," the voice continued. "We knew they would try to destroy you just as they tried to destroy us. And when that day came, our weapons would awaken, and so would we." A new light appeared in the chamber, and Tanaka turned to see the central pod beginning to glow. The figure inside was the same woman from the recording, and her eyes were open, and she was looking directly at Tanaka. "The cycle has begun again," the woman said, her voice now real instead of recorded. "And you are exactly what we hoped you would become." She pressed her hand against the inside of the pod, and the surface dissolved like mist. The woman stepped out and stood before Tanaka, towering over the human scientist, but looking at her with an expression of profound warmth. "I am Alindra," she said. "I was a general in the last war, and I have been waiting a very long time to meet you." Tanaka struggled to find words. "We are your descendants," she finally managed. "We are related to you." Alindra smiled, and the expression was so familiar that Tanaka felt tears forming in her eyes. "You are our children," Alindra replied. "You are everything we hoped for and more. And now you do not have to face the conclave alone around them." Other pods began to glow as the architects awakened from their million-year slumber. "Tell your fleet commander that help is coming," Alindra said. "And tell her that the weapons they found are only the beginning." She looked up at the ceiling, toward the battle raging somewhere above them in space. "The Conclave believes they defeated us long ago," she said. "Today they will learn that they were very, very wrong." The Battle of Seoul raged for 3 months, and it became the most destructive conflict in the history of the galaxy. High Admiral Corveth stood on the bridge of his ancient dreadnought and watched his fleet die around him. For 100,000 ships had seemed like an overwhelming force, and the combined military might of 12 civilizations should have been enough to crush any enemy. And the mathematics of the war had clearly favored the conclave, but the mathematics had been wrong. Human fleet had grown from 800 ships to over 12,000 as the hidden factories produced new vessels at terrifying speed, and each ship was armed with weapons that made conclave technology seem primitive. And then there was the Sentinel. Corveth still remembered the moment the ancient battle station had appeared on his sensors, a structure so vast that his tactical officers had first mistaken it for a small moon. It had drifted in from the outer system with an almost lazy grace, and then it had opened fire. A single beam from the Sentinel had destroyed 17 Korath crystal dreadnoughts in one shot, and the shockwave from that destruction had damaged another 40 vessels nearby. "We cannot win this," Admiral Vesic of the Korath had screamed through the communication channel. "We must retreat and regroup and find another way." But there was no other way, and they all knew if humanity survived this war, they would never be vulnerable again, and the Conclave would never have another chance to destroy them. So they fought on, and they died by the thousands. Human vessels moved through the battle like predators among prey, and their dimensional weapons ignored shields and armor, and their phase drives let them appear and disappear at will. Commander Vasquez had become a legend among both fleets, and her tactical genius had turned every conclave assault into a massacre. But Corveth was not defeated yet. He had been a warrior for 40,000 years, and he had seen empires rise and fall, and he refused to accept extinction without one final attempt. "All remaining vessels, form up on my position," he commanded. "We will strike at the human flagship directly, and if we can kill their commander, we may break their coordination." The survivors of the Conclave fleet gathered around his dreadnought, barely 3,000 ships out of the 400,000 that had begun the assault. They charged toward the Defiance in a desperate final push. Vasquez saw them coming and smiled grimly. "They are making their last stand," she said to Alindra, who stood beside her on the bridge. "The High Admiral is brave. He is desperate," Alindra corrected. "But yes, he is also brave, and that deserves respect. Should we finish them?" Lieutenant Chen asked, her finger hovering over the weapons controls. Vasquez considered the question for a long moment. 3 months of battle had hardened her in ways she had never expected, and she had watched friends die and ships burn, and an entire civilization try to murder her species. Part of her wanted vengeance, but another part remembered the stories Alindra had told her about the First War, about how the architects had chosen mercy instead of destruction, about how they had refused to become the monsters they were fighting. "Disable their weapons and engines," Vasquez ordered, "but do not destroy them." Chen looked surprised, but obeyed the command. Defiance and its escort ships swept through the conclave formation with surgical precision, and beams of light struck the enemy vessels and stripped away their ability to fight. Within an hour, the entire conclave fleet was drifting helplessly in space. Vasquez ordered a shuttle prepared and flew to Corveth's dreadnought. Personalive High Admiral was waiting for her when she boarded, standing tall despite his obvious wounds, and his four eyes watched her with a mixture of hatred and something that might have been respect. "You have won," he said simply. "Do what you must." Vasquez looked at the ancient warrior and felt the weight of the moment. "The conclave declared war on humanity because we were different," she said. "Because we found technology that frightened you, and because you saw us as a threat to be eliminated." Corveth said nothing, but his silence was confirmation enough. "The architects could have destroyed your ancestors," Vasquez continued. "They had weapons that could have erased your species from existence, but they chose not to use them." She stepped closer to the High Admiral. "They hoped that your people would eventually learn to live alongside other civilizations, that you would grow beyond fear and embrace the galaxy as partners instead of subjects. They were naive," Corveth replied bitterly. "Perhaps," Vasquez admitted, "but I think they were also right, because here I am, standing before you with the power to end your entire species, and I am choosing not to use it." She turned to look out the viewport. At the shattered remains of the Conclave fleet. "The war is over," she declared. "Your empires will be reduced to your homeworlds, and you will be monitored to ensure you never threaten another species again. But you will live." Korvath stared at her with obvious confusion. "Why?" he demanded. "We tried to exterminate you, and we would have killed every human in existence, and you would be justified in returning the same treatment." Vasquez smiled sadly. "Because genocide is not who we are," she said, "and it is not who we want to become." She left Korvath standing in his ruined bridge and returned to the Defiant. HFY War was over, but the work was just beginning. 3 months later, Commander Vasquez stood with Alindra on the observation deck of a new space station. Orbiting Earth architects had chosen not to rebuild their own civilization, and their numbers were too few, and their time, they said, had passed, but they remained as advisors and teachers and guides for the species that would inherit their legacy. "What happens now?" Vasquez asked. Looking out at the stars, Alindra smiled with an expression that combined hope and sadness. "Now you inherit the galaxy," she said. "We built you to survive, and we left you our weapons because we knew you would need them. But what you do with that inheritance is entirely up to you." She turned to face Vasquez directly. "We were afraid of the Conclave," she admitted. "We hid and slept and let fear dictate our survival, and because of that choice, we lost our civilization and our future." Her eyes held a fierce intensity. "Do not make our mistake," she urged. "Do not hide, and do not let fear control you, but instead build something better, something that will last longer than empires and wars and hatred." Vasquez looked out at the galaxy that now lay open before humanity. 100 billion stars waited, and somewhere among them were countless species who had never heard of humans or architects, or the Conclave. Would need guidance and protection, and the chance to grow into something greater in humanity, armed with the legacy of gods and the wisdom of their ancestors, was finally ready to provide it. "We will not hide," Vasquez promised. "We will build something that would make you proud." Alindra placed a hand on her descendant's shoulder. "You already have," she said. Soft lithe defiance turned toward the galactic core and engaged its engines, and humanity began its journey toward a future that their ancestors had dreamed of. 1,000,000 years Agath universe had turned against them, and it had no idea who had built their weapons. No, it would learn what those children could truly become. Commander Vasquez stood in the shuttle bay of the Defiance and watched as the transport from Mars descended through the atmospheric shield. The past 12 hours had been the strangest of her life, and she had received reports that defied everything humanity believed about its place in the universe. No, she was about to meet the being who had sent those reports. The transport landed with a soft hiss, and the doors opened to reveal Dr. Tanaka walking beside the tallest woman Vasquez had ever seen. Alindra moved with a grace that seemed impossible for someone her size, and her silver skin caught the light of the shuttle bay in ways that made her seem almost ethereal. But her eyes were sharp and focused, and filled with an intelligence that spanned 1,000,000 years. "Commander Vasquez," Alindra said, extending her hand in a gesture that was unmistakably human. "I have watched your battle from the surface, and I am impressed." Vasquez shook the offered hand and felt a strange warmth flow through her, as if something deep in her DNA recognized the being before her. "I have many questions," Vasquez said, "and I will answer all of them," Alindra replied. "But first we must address the immediate threat, because the Conclave is regrouping, and their next assault will be far larger than the first." She turned to face the bridge crew who had gathered to see the legendary precursor. "With their own eyes, your weapons performed exactly as we designed them," Alindra continued. "The primary cannon, the dimensional rifles, the phase shields, they are all functioning perfectly. But they were meant to be used alongside other systems that you have not yet discovered." "What other systems?" Vasquez asked. Alindra smiled and raised her hand, and a holographic display appeared in the air between them. It showed the solar system, but it was different from any map Vasquez had seen before. There were markers on every planet and moon and asteroid field, thousands of points of light that the human sensors had never detected. "We did not simply leave weapons for you," Alindra explained. "We left an entire infrastructure, hidden and dormant, waiting for the day when it would be needed." She pointed to a marker near Saturn, There's a manufacturing facility in the rings of Saturn that can produce warships at a rate of 100 per day, she said. It has been waiting for activation codes that only an architect or one of our descendants can provide. She pointed to another marker in the asteroid belt. There are 17 weapons platforms hidden among the asteroids, each one armed with cannons, larger than the one on your Defiance. She swept her hand across the display, highlighting dozens more locations, and at the edge of your outer system, in the frozen darkness beyond the farthest planets, there's a battle station that we called the Sentinel, and it has been watching over your solar system since before your species existed. Vasquez stared at the display with growing wonder. Why did you not tell us about any of this? She asked. Why did you let us struggle alone when you had all of this waiting? Alindra's expression grew serious. Because you were not ready, she replied. The weapons we left on Mars were a test, and only a species that had grown strong enough to find them, study them, and master them would be capable of using the greater systems. She looked at Vasquez. With something like pride, you passed the test, Commander, and now you will have access to everything. Alindra reached out and touched Vasquez's forehead with 2 fingers, and suddenly information flooded into the commander's mind codes and coordinates, and operating instructions appeared in her thoughts as if they had always been there, and she understood systems she had never seen and weapons she had never imagined. Your neural implants are compatible with our technology, Alindra explained. They were designed that way, even though your engineers did not know it, because we influenced the development of that technology from the beginning. Vasquez staggered for a moment as the flood of data settled into her consciousness, and then she looked up with new understanding in her eyes. I know how to activate the Sentinel, she said in wonder. Yes, Alindra confirmed, and so does every human with a neural implant, because the codes are tied to your DNA, and the system recognizes you as our children. She stepped back and addressed the gathered crew. We are fewer than 100,000 survivors, she said. Too few to fight this war alone, but that was never our intention. Because this is not our war. She looked at Vasquez with an expression of profound respect. This is your war, she continued. You are the inheritors of everything we built, and you will be the ones who determine the future of this galaxy, and we will stand beside you and guide you. But the victory must be yours. An alarm sounded throughout the ship, and Lieutenant Chen's voice came over the communication system. Commander, we have detected incoming vessels, and the Conclave fleet has received reinforcements, and they are advancing. Vasquez turned to the main screen as the tactical display appeared, and her blood ran cold at what she saw. 400,000 ships filled the void, nearly 10 times the size of the original fleet. Every species of the Conclave had committed their full military strength to this assault, and they were determined to end the war before the human threat could grow any larger. They know, Alindra said quietly. They have realized what your weapons mean, and they understand that they are not fighting humans alone, and now they are throwing everything they have at you before we can fully awaken. Vasquez turned to her crew, and she saw fear in their faces, but she also saw determination. Transmit the activation codes to all hidden installations, she commanded. Wake up the Saturn factory, bring the weapons platforms online, and activate the Sentinel. She looked at Alindra. How many of your people are awake? 3,000 so far, Alindra replied. But more are waking every hour. Then let us show the Conclave what happens when they attack the children of the architects, Vasquez declared. Across the solar system, ancient systems began to respond to human commands for the first time in a million years. In the rings of Saturn, a facility the size of a small moon hummed to life and began producing warships at impossible speed among the asteroids. Weapons platforms rose from their hiding places and trained their massive cannons on the approaching enemy. And at the edge of the system, something vast and terrible awoke from its long slumber. Sentinel was coming online, and the Conclave had no idea what was about to hit them.